Thanks so much, Iftikhar. Um, Thanks everyone for coming back in. I know that the side conversations are always some of the most interesting that happen at conferences like these, but we do need to give time for everyone to actually have the organized presentations. So, as Iftikhar said, this is the second panel of the day, and it's. Does it have a title? Does it have a title? Ah, okay. I'm like, did I miss something completely? So sorry about that. You couldn't think of good titles. The papers have great titles, so we just go with that. So there's going to be two papers, and and I think taking on some of the questions that came up in the last panel, and I missed two of the papers in the last panel, so my apologies for that. I had to run to another event. It's family weekend at Cornell, so many of us have to go do silly little presentations all around. So I was doing that, and I missed the actual presentations, but caught the sort of the tail end of the conversation. And it seems to me that this panel will sort of address some of the questions that were coming up in some of the sort of, especially in Sonal's sort of comments and provocations. So the first paper is by Aparna Parikh, who's from Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Pennsylvania State University. Aparna is an assistant teaching professor in that department and in Asian studies. And she's a feminist urban geographer who focuses on gendered dimensions of urban environmental belonging in South Asian cities. So Aparna's paper is titled Socio-Environmental Imbrications and Epistemological Borderlands. And that's where I think it addresses then the kinds of questions that were coming up, some of the questions in the last panel. I'll introduce the second speaker when he's ready to present, but Aparna, all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really interesting to kind of end the previous panel on thinking about borders and borderlands. And hopefully I'm going to talk a lot about that, but hopefully it's a different kind of entry point to thinking about borders and borderlands. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this dialogue. Thanks also to Daniel Bass, Phoebe Wagner, and Gloria Lemus-Chavez for their organizational and logistical work. The work I'm going to present today is part of a new project on the knowledge forms and circulations of ideas about climate, environmental change, and urban development in Mumbai. So I'm presenting something that is very much a work in progress and would greatly appreciate the feedback here. Okay. So this paper advances the work of the queer Chicana poet and feminist theorist Gloria Anzaldúa and her conception of borderlands to make sense of social and environmental entanglements, confluences, and linguistic associations in Mumbai. Anzaldúa explains that the borderland helps us move from a firm border to think about the process of bordering and the in-between zone as a physical, cultural, and linguistic space that is thick with meaning and holds potential to reimagine neat separations and develop a new consciousness. I apply these ideas to look at discourses surrounding mangroves in Mumbai. Mangroves buffer land and sea, and as such are seen as an environmental safeguard to protect the city from the heavy influx of seawater that can cause floods, and entrapping soil whose escape can otherwise erode the coastline. Conserving mangroves then is seen as a silver bullet to mitigate climate change. An increase in mangroves then is seen as a net positive, and a decrease is seen as a net negative. In this imaginary, mangroves help cement a clear boundary between land and sea. I suggest that the well-intentioned emphasis on conserving mangroves is inadequate, although not unnecessary, and misses out on a fuller picture of the place and significance of mangroves in Mumbai's environments. So mangroves, which grow in intertidal spaces, can be seen as a borderland. A linguistic, spatial, and botanical exploration shows the rich engagement between land and sea, salt and freshwater, and silt and sludge that takes place in this more expansively imagined contact zone. Mangrove roots trap not only sand, but also plastic, giving rise to composite ecologies that are irreducible to botanical classifications. Often uncomfortable to navigate and with what is sometimes imagined as limited visual appeal, mangroves can be seen as sites of aesthetic refusal that can then confound conservation narratives. An attunement to the multiple meanings, experiences, and ecologies helps thicken mangroves from a line of separation to a zone that is rife with contradictions and slippages, and can shed light on the inseparability of ecology and sensory dimensions, on waste value dynamics, and the perpetual making and remaking of spatial and categorical boundaries. So, following an explanation of Anzal Dua's work on borderlands in the context of Mumbai's urban natures, I will then expand upon mangroves, what they are and what they signify for conservation efforts. Next, based on a reading within dominant discourses, I put forward 3 provocations to help us reimagine the engagement of mangroves with water, waste, as well as other flora and fauna. In doing so, I show how looking at the interstices of spaces, ecologies, and knowledge frameworks can provide perhaps new environmental epistemologies, which are based on embodied linguistic and aesthetic registers. So, Gloria Anzaldúa conceptualizes borderlands as a way to understand the, as I said, the ambiguous physical, cultural, and linguistic space formed along the Mexico-US border. She presents a place-based understanding of identity formation, where the border is used to designate groups into hierarchical formations or a way to distinguish us from them. Anzaldúa uses the borderland as a frame to make sense of geographic and social bordering processes, and in envisioning spaces that not only lie in between, but can also give rise to what she calls a third country that presents opportunities for new and sometimes emancipatory social formations and alliances. I do want to acknowledge that there are some troubling gaps and limitations in her work, but I'm not going to expand on those in the presentation, but kind of going to think through this in the kind of writing of the work. The ecological implications of her work are addressed in Melissa Wright's work, who looks at the opposition to Trump's border wall and shows how anti-wall activists have applied this kind of border thinking across social and ecological realms and found common cause across concerns around immigration reform and ecological harm along this very same Mexico-US border to showcase a kind of broader commitment and understanding of diversity, thereby reframing the borderland as a bioregion. So I built upon these ideas to analyze the process of border making and knowledge production about mangroves and show how the mangroves themselves, the local lexicons around them, and their interactions with other species creates a type of borderland that defies rigid classifications. I read within rather than outside widely prevalent narratives about mangroves and strategies for their conservation as presented through media articles, policy reports, and other sources. Nefati Tariar and others call this reading within the grain, a type of reading that allows us to seek what might otherwise fall away, seeking in it kind of the fragments and debris that mark the limits of hegemonic narratives and provide us with elements of unrecognized and overlooked modes of viable life. I also conducted what I'm calling a kind of reciprocal translation, which I can explain more about. I briefly do touch upon it in the presentation, that allows for a new experimental reading of the relation of ecological with other sensory dimensions. This creative reading of language and its shifting meanings can be seen as what Macarena Gomez Badis calls a submerged perspective that allows us to perceive life otherwise, one that allows us to pierce through the entanglements of power to differently organize the meanings of social and political life. As such, I draw on the borderland as a conceptual and methodological analytic to provide new epistemological frameworks. So, what are mangroves? In a sense, I'm trying to do like a deep dive into that, but also as a kind of botanical understanding, they're an ecosystem of trees and shrubs that live in intertidal zones or the areas between low and high tides. They have what is a fairly unique propensity to survive in brackish water, and as well as breathe in low oxygen environments, where the slow movement of water allows sand to sediment. So within a kind of global movement to conserve mangroves because of their significance for protecting coastlines and for carbon sequestration, Maharashtra's mangrove cell and their Mumbai unit work on mangrove protection, afforestation, and cleanup campaigns in light of encroachment, waste dumping, and pollution. Their initiatives include mangrove protection zones, ecotourism initiatives, and satellite mapping, extensive work on satellite mapping to inspect the extent of mangroves and any change in it. So the mangrove cell sees the protected status accorded to mangroves, the setting up of the Biodiversity Center, and a 5% increase in mangrove cover from 2017 to 19 as some of its key successes. And I'm trying to deconstruct some of that here. So mangroves are often talked about as a buffer space with an emphasis more on what they separate, which is land and water. So instead, if we look at it as a contact zone or the muddy and sometimes tense meeting point between land and water, we might be able to disrupt some of this structure of separation. The first kind of provocation is kind of thinking about invasive mangroves. Mangroves not only prevent the encroachment of water onto land or sand into sea, but can themselves be a form of encroachment or invasive species in some instances. So the extent of mangroves is often used to signal the tug of war between development pressures and efforts to mitigate climate change. An increase in mangroves often becomes a direct indicator of the success in addressing environmental degradation. Satellite images of coastlines are closely studied and monitored to analyze changing mangrove cover. This top-down calculation flattens like the volume of mangroves into a two-dimensional image, in turn flattening the complexity of what mangrove change actually entails or signals. So, as I mentioned, mangroves grow in salt water. When salt water overtakes or submerges fresh water, mangroves then spread out, destroying or replacing other species and landforms that were previously present in that fresh water or on land. So, as such, a change in mangroves can indicate changing boundaries between fresh and salt water, qualities that cannot immediately be captured in satellite images. An influx of saline water onto freshwater and existing landforms can occur due to rising sea levels, as well as coastal erosion due to sand mining. So sand mining has increased the water carrying capacity of creeks, wherein more and more saline water impinges upon and destroys fertile agricultural areas. Following this salt, then, mangroves in turn encroach upon or become the invasive species that overtake other land uses. So while sand mining eats away into the coastline, the release of effluents into Mumbai's creeks increases siltation, creating shallow areas that are also very fertile for mangroves. In this case, mangroves invade and narrow the creek, and in turn make the discharge of sewage from the city an even bigger challenge. Further, such mangrove growth also threatens existing mudflats, which provide important nutrients for Mumbai's flamingos to survive and thrive. And so there's a concern that the spread of mangroves can then invade upon and inhibit the habitat of this species. And mangrove flamingo dynamics are really interesting because then they're also used for, well, I'll get to that a little bit later. But so I suggest that we approach changes in mangrove extent with caution. Such changes are not a straightforward indicator of climate change mitigation, but could in fact signal development pressures inwards from swollen water capacity in creeks due to sand mining, or outwards due to the discharge of effluents into creeks. Following the mangroves then allows us to gain insight into development trajectories, which might at first glance seem at odds with the much celebrated role of mangroves in preventing environmental degradation. So, okay. I'm going to go over time. The second section is on knotty roots. The mangroves serve as a metonymy for breathing in a city where development processes are otherwise seen as choking the possibility for life and well-being. Mangroves, in particularly their knotty roots, are an important site to examine how sand, salt, water, and plastic interact and create conditions for breathing, even as they remain in danger of choking. Reading these spaces as a composite ecology, I suggest that these roots resist easy bordering between the plastic and the ecological and require an epistemological reframing that attends to material entanglements. Growing in intertidal zones, mangroves witness the ebb and flow of water between high and low tides. Sediment drags along with these flows and is trapped in the roots. This property allows mangroves to manage coastal erosion and is a key aspect for conservation initiatives. But along with sand, they also trap plastic. And environmental activists have put in nets to trap and separate the plastic from the mangroves, which otherwise themselves become a wasteland. So my understanding of already existing hybridity is informed by looking at and translating between English and Marathi terms, where terms such as environment translate both to Paryavaran, but also to Sanyukt, which when translated back can help us think about the environment as a composite, and kind of this more hybrid formulation of composite elements. This draws upon my previous work on urban climates with Nida Rahman and various others, where we propose kind of an expansive lexicon grounded in local expressions of climate for a more nuanced understanding. So such reframing can have crucial implications for an understanding of existing material conditions amidst development, conservation, and environmental change. The third is sensory ecologies. So the everyday experiences of mangroves is the focus of my final section. Mangroves can be uncomfortable to navigate and are sometimes seen as having limited aesthetic appeal, which can be complicated for conservation. So my analysis of the sensory dimensions, including kind of bodily, linguistic, and visual registers, suggests the potential of reworking the scale of analysis and the place of language to provide alternative imaginaries. I'm gonna skip one of this. Just to harken back to Anzaldúa, she talks about linguistic borderlands, or the spaces at the Mexico-US border where English and Spanish are both spoken, and for her intersect in how she speaks, imagines, but also writes. Of course, in South Asia too, our everyday life is consistently informed by multilinguality, but for me at least has not always translated into how I write. But here I'm trying to place her idea of linguistic borderlands with the kind of previously mentioned framework of urban climates to develop a somewhat experimental approach for this kind of idea of translation. And so I kind of move between English and Marathi to think about how the description or understanding of mangroves moves from the trees of the wetland to a feeling of dampness, or a feeling of stickiness, which also kind of came through in my ethnographic fieldwork, where a lot of Koli fisherwomen saw these spaces as sometimes being uncomfortable, but also saw these spaces as important environmental resources because they used to collect sticks from there, but also simultaneously saw it as an environmental safeguard. So they saw it as in kind of a pretty multidimensional understanding, which I think comes through in the kind of language-based understanding as well. There's also kind of the aesthetic register in thinking about mangrove-flamingo relations, where they're often bundled in conservation efforts, even as they can sometimes compete for land and space. So there's some contradictions there as well. So just kind of skipping a little bit towards the end, my arguments are that the mangroves and their affinity for salt and silt-filled environments provide us a glimpse into the imprint and spatial trajectory of development endeavors and how these are shaping changing coastlines. Second, by trapping plastic, mangroves themselves become a type of wasteland that can challenge conservation efforts. And finally, this idea of like their experience of stickiness, sometimes discomfort, and limited visual appeal can confound kind of the aesthetic appeal that is very much central to conservation. So the arguments I'm making through through presenting these provocations are first that moving between ways of saying or speaking, as is kind of facilitated through an interpretive process of language translation, allows us to situate the place of embodied encounters and aesthetic cues in ecological knowledge. Second, ecology is deeply riddled with plastic, silt, and other materials, and staying with and close to such implications as, kind of referencing back some of the things that Rupali was saying yesterday, might be useful in explaining conservation challenges and limitations in these kind of silver bullet solutions. Third, the borderlands are useful in making sense of ecologies that complicate existing structures of separation, such as between silt and sludge, fresh and salt water, development and conservation, waste and value, and kind of think about what lies in the gaps within these processes and spaces. Rather than being asides, such considerations provide us important insights about contradictions and intersections between development and conservation initiatives, as well as epistemological possibilities for perhaps more complex urban ecologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aparna, for truncating the talk there. But I hope the questions that you get would open up some of the issues that you wrote about more in the paper itself.